Good evening and welcome to Hampton University under the stellar leadership of our president, Darrell K. Williams. I'm Julia Wilson, Dean of the Scripps Howard School of Journalism and Communications. And we are so pleased to have you join us this evening for this exclusive and important panel discussion on eminent domain. Thanks to the Virginia Center for Investigative Journalism at WHRO and ProPublica for bringing this panel of investigative journalism and journalists and experts to our campus today. Thank you so much for joining us. We will be discussing what is termed as erasing the black spot. We thank them for shedding light on how Virginia universities have disrupted and diminished Black neighborhoods in the name of progress and economic growth, most often using the eminent domain law to seize Black Americans' properties, and on how these property seizures have socially and economically impacted and damaged thriving Black communities across the state of Virginia, and actually across this nation. These damages continue hindering Black Americans from closing the wealth gap between Black and white families. They also have prevented Black Americans from building and accumulating generational wealth through home ownership. I was born and raised in Tulsa, Oklahoma, formerly known as Black Wall Street, so I can personally relate to this issue and others. Before our moderator introduces the panel, I'd like to acknowledge a few Hampton University administrators and community leaders who are with us this evening. Newport News Mayor Philip Jones, would you stand, Mayor Jones, Thank you. Mayor Jones also serves as the Associate Vice President of Institutional Effectiveness and Strategic Planning here at Hampton University. Welcome. Mayor Donnie Tuck could not be with us this evening, but he is represented by Brian DiProfolio. Are you here? Would you stand? Thank you. Who is the city manager for the city of Hampton, and by Gabe Diaz. Okay, thank you. He's Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Also with us is Mr. Vidal Dickerson. Mr. Dickerson, would you please stand? He's the Special Assistant to the President of Christopher Newport University and Chief Diversity Officer. Welcome. Mr. Bill Thomas is here from Hampton as the Vice President from the Office of Government Relations. Mr. Bill Thomas. Also, we welcome Dr. Robert Watson, Distinguished Assistant History Professor in the Department of Political Science, History, and International Studies. And we have three important members of the Johnson family who have been impacted by eminent domain, and you will learn more about them a little bit later in the program. Would you please stand? Thank you for joining us. I'd also just like to acknowledge and thank my faculty, students, and assistant dean for their help in preparing for you to join us tonight. And now I will turn the program over to our panel discussion moderator, Ms. Lisa Godley. Lisa is a 5-time Emmy Award-winning television producer and senior producer of diverse productions and outreach at WHRO. She produces a program called Race, Let's Talk About It. Lisa also is the producer of the highly acclaimed radio show, Another View, that airs on National Public Radio and features discussions on issues from a Black American perspective. It is my great pleasure to introduce to some and reacquaint to others, Ms. Lisa Godley. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you so very much. Put this back here. You know, since we're in college here tonight, I want to ask you all a question. And I want you to help me with a show of hands. How many of you, prior to reading Brandy's article, knew that in 1915, Black families owned 60% of the land in the state of Virginia? Who knew that? When I read that, it took my breath away. 60%. Well, tonight we're going to talk a little bit about how a large portion of that land was taken as we have this discussion. And I want to take a moment right now to introduce you to this stellar panel. Brandy Kellum is an Emmy Award-winning journalist and lead investigative reporter for ProPublica's local reporting network partnership with the Virginia Center for Investigative Journalism at WHRO. She previously reported and produced national stories for CBS News, where she contributed to the network's historic coverage of Donald Trump's 2020 Senate impeachment trial and the death of Minneapolis resident George Floyd in police custody. In 2021, she received a reporting grant from Columbia University's Ira A. Lippman Center for Journalism and Civil and Human Rights, where she focused on her reporting on housing injustice and inequality in Newport News, Virginia. Ladies and gentlemen, Brandy Kellum. Beside her is Louis Hanson. He is co-founder and editor of the Virginia Center for Investigative Journalism at WHRO. He's a national award-winning investigative journalist whose work has included or is included in a collection of the best narrative newspaper writing in America. He was a 2015 John S. Knight Journalism Fellow at Stanford University. He's previously reported at the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Virginian Pilot, and the San Jose Mercury News. Ladies and gentlemen, Lou Hanson. Beside Lou is Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander. If you listen to Another View, you've heard Cassandra. Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander is an endowed professor of Virginia Black History and Culture at Norfolk State University. She has written award-winning articles on 19th century Virginia and the Underground Railroad. Her publications also cover African American history in the Civil War in Hampton Roads. She has served on several boards, including the Virginia Commission on African American History Education in the Commonwealth. Newby Alexander has appeared on numerous national programs and documentaries for networks including NBC, BBC, and C-SPAN. Josh Baker. Josh Baker is an attorney at the Norfolk law firm of Waldo and Lyle. He specializes in eminent domain law, exclusively representing property owners throughout Virginia and Washington, D.C. He is a graduate of Hillsdale College and the College of William and Mary, Marshall with School of Law. Josh Baker. All right, before we start talking to our panelists, I do want you to see something. Our first clip, it's about Shoe Lane, and here we go.
We weren't just like neighbors, we were like relatives. That's how close this neighborhood was.
We had to work hard to get this house. And you hear the term sweat and blood, that's what we put in this house, sweat and blood.
I grew up here and I worked with the farm here. It has more than just a piece of property. It's a lifestyle, it's a means of ownership, and I have a right to ownership, but it was taken away from me.
This has happened all over the country, not only here, but in other parts of the country, where it just seemed like wherever black people have property, and if something that they want, they take it.
Brandy, I am going to start this discussion with you. Tell us a little bit about the Shoe Lane community and what it was becoming at the time that all this transpired.
So can everybody hear me? Okay, yes. So as you saw in that clip there, the Johnsons and many other families were living in the Shoe Lane community in the 1950s and 60s, but it had been a community that had been in existence as a predominantly black community since the late 1800s. It was mainly farmland. Mr. Johnson's grandfather purchased about 30 acres of land there, and at the point that we are in the 1950s, 1960s, the Johnsons were looking to subdivide their 30 acres of family land to become a middle-class black community. And that's important because at the time in 1950s, 1960s, as we all know, Newport News had not integrated many of their communities, their schools, and this was an area that would have been sort of like a safe haven and an opportunity for families who were looking to become doctors and lawyers, and there were teachers living in this community, and they all wanted to live together so that they could commune with each other and be a connected community. Some families had married into each other, so it was a very close-knit community in the 1950s and 60s. And it, as I said earlier, had started off as farmland, but there was opportunity, and the Johnsons and many other families saw that this could have been opportunity for black families at the time to have a place where they could live and enjoy their living and environment and take advantage of what Newport News was becoming at the time.
Okay, I have a follow-up question for you.
Okay.
Some might say, some might say that this just happened to be the closest neighborhood to the school. What evidence did you find that this was racially motivated?
Yeah, so there were a lot of there's a lot of pieces of evidence here. So the first one is there was a big uproar when the city of Newport News, which was an all-white city council at the time, decided to essentially target this community for Christopher Newport University. The evidence is that, number one, in years prior to that, not even 5 or 6 years prior to that, there were 2 other largely black communities of families who were looking to build and establish a tight-knit neighborhood like the Shoe Lane community was looking to do, that had been taken by eminent domain in previous years, as I said, maybe within like the 5 or 6 years prior to when the Newport News City Council decided to target Shoe Lane. So that was one piece of evidence that you saw this happening very close to the time in other communities as it was now happening to the Shoe Lane community in 1961. The second part of it is that there were other areas where the city could have placed the college. So there were more cheaper alternative sites available that were less controversial, that did not have a large group of black citizens looking to already develop as the Johnsons were. They already had civil engineering maps. The city had already approved them subdividing one of their pieces of land already. They already had people moving onto that piece of land. And even with all that being said, the city council decided to take and seize this property by eminent domain.
Okay, one more question to you before the rest of the panel starts to feel a little neglected, but I'm going to ask you one more question.
Okay.
You have a personal connection to this story, so I want you to share a little bit of that before we move on.
Okay, so I'm actually from here, not Newport News, but I was born and raised Chesapeake, Virginia, went to Deep Creek High School, and as an athlete at Deep Creek High School, I ran track. I competed at Christopher Newport University. So that was about, now I'm aging myself, 20 years ago. And so if you think about, when I think about that connection to the school, and as a black high school athlete, running on land that had been formerly owned by black people, sort of making a way for myself as a young black woman wanting to advance my career in track and, you know, advance my career in academics and athletics, it really hit home to me that the place where I was looking to aspire to be something great was also a place where greatness was taken away from people. because they weren't allowed to enact or carry out their own plans of establishing generational wealth for their families.
Thank you. Lou, I want to ask you one quick question about this explosive growth of university and colleges in the 1950s and 60s. Could you just kind of give us a synopsis of what was going on in Virginia?
Sure. Virginia was like most other states. The baby boom generation was getting ready to get into college. It was the Cold War era, and there was a concern that the United States needed to produce more scientists, more engineers, and more well-educated population. So the College of William and Mary had 2 satellite colleges, one in Newport News, it was Christopher Newport College at the time, and also Old Dominion University, which was in Norfolk. And both of those schools decided to expand into black neighborhoods. And the federal government placed a big emphasis on it as well by subsidizing these expansions. So cities really had to pay very little to redevelop, and universities were eager to take that kind of money and grow.
All right, Josh, before we get any further, I do want to ask you to explain what eminent domain is and how easy is it for the city to seize property or for the...
Sure. Well, first let me just thank Hampton University for hosting this very important panel and discussion tonight, and to the Center for Investigative Journalism for having us here to have this conversation. It's a double privilege because my law firm and I actually represent Hampton University. I see Bill Thomas up there. Say hello to Bill. And in some ongoing litigation, we have for a long time, as VDOT and other governmental entities have sought to take property from Hampton University. But eminent domain is a constitutional power that resides in the federal Constitution, but also in our Virginia Constitution, that empowers the government to take property from private property owners under 2 conditions. And the first is that they can only exercise that power for a public use. It's the government, that means kind of all of us, who's taking it. And so the traditional uses for the eminent domain power would be things like building a road, building a school, building a courthouse, things that we all use, the public use. The second condition to that is that that property can only be taken with the payment of just compensation. And in Virginia, our state constitution gives a little more protection than the federal constitution. And just compensation in Virginia means that, of course, they owe you for what it is they take from you, the rights or the land. Sometimes they don't take a whole property. Maybe they just take a piece of it. And so in Virginia, if they take a piece of the property, just compensation also includes the diminishment to the value of what you're left with. And so I always kind of say, if we're at a closing table and I'm about to buy a piece of property from you, and we've struck a price, say, for $100 to make it easy, and you say, well, you know, Josh, there's one thing I forgot to tell you. VDOT's going to put a road through the middle of it, and they're going to take these other easements across the property that are going to make it really tough for you to continue to use it. Well, go ahead and sign that paper and pay me the $100. Well, wait a minute. No. There's some kind of impact that's happened. And so if the government comes along to take property for all of our use, then they have to pay to make that owner whole. And that's what our cases all talk about, is the owner is supposed to be put in as good a position as they were before the taking.
I am going to show you another clip right now. This is former CNU president.
I'd heard that the goal was to wipe it out completely, you know, no houses or anything, but there was such an uproar at the time that they justified by saying, well, we don't need farmland in the middle of the city, and they just took the farm, but they took away all these people's farms. The whole center of the campus was, nothing belonged to anybody but these people, the residents. And I think they would have taken everything if they could have gotten, I mean, I was told that was the plan. It was to erase the black spot. They called it a black spot.
the systematic dismantling of Shoe Lane community and other key findings. Talk to me a little bit about that.
So we know that I'm talking about systematic dismantling, and when I talk about that, I'm referring to the reporting that we've done that shows that over a period of time, that the Shoe Lane community was essentially dismantled by various powers that were beyond, that were more powerful than the community itself. So we already know about the 1960s and the seizing of the core of the community by eminent domain by the all-white city council at the time in Newport News. What many people don't know, and this is what struck me as interesting about this story, is I didn't know that this happened to the community in the 1960s, and I did speak to a couple of people about it. I spoke to a professor at CNU, and I got the story from him. He actually, to his credit, did write some research about it. However, what I found interesting was that while that happened in the 1960s, up until at least 2010, maybe a little bit earlier than that, there were still about maybe 70, 50, 60, 70 houses on the outskirts of the community. So that was more than 40 years beyond the 1960s taken, and in my mind, it piqued my interest. And so what I learned about what happened is that after the 1960s, this explains why the houses still existed in the late some of the houses still existed in the late 1990s, and then suddenly there are just only 5 houses left. So what we learned is that not only did the community's core become part of city property for the college in the 1960s, but that there still were Black people living on the outskirts, and some still moved in. And then there was a lawsuit that happened in the 1980s that I learned about in my reporting, which the community at the time went into federal court and sued the college because the college extended its boundaries to take the rest of the houses that were on the perimeter. So when you think about systematically breaking down a community, you have the core that was seized in the 1960s, and the Black residents at the time went up against an all-white city council, and they lost there. That was one institution that essentially they lost against. And then in the 1980s, they went into federal court, and they went up against the college at the time in the state of Virginia because they were aware that the school had extended its boundaries to encompass the rest of their homes. Like, the key part is they weren't aware. So they found out about this by reading the newspaper. And so when that occurred, they did try to fight that, but they lost. The case was dismissed before going to trial. And now you have from 1980s, I'm not going to go into a nitty-gritty detail, but like just fast forwarding 1980s to 2010, you see houses just dropping like flies, like all around the perimeter of the college. And essentially, the way that is explained is that there was a new regime that came in that had more power at the university that essentially, what we learned is used the threat of eminent domain. And some of the homeowners felt pressured. Some of them did sell. Some of them, like the Johnsons, are still standing strong, holding on to their house. But essentially, under that pressure of eminent domain, even in later years, these residents weren't able to stand up to that. So systemically, they failed at every turn in front of city council, in the legal system, against the college. And those are 3 powerful institutions that they could not fight up against. Now, what's admirable to me is that they tried, because you don't see a lot of communities doing that, but they did try. And I think that says a lot about how much they wanted to stay. But again, at every turn they failed, and that's how the system was able to essentially diminish the community to only 5 houses today.
Wow. I want to get into the whole psychological aspect of that, so I'm going to play another clip right now.
What does it mean when your home, the place that you have cultivated, created, when you can see and you've witnessed everything you've known be demolished in a time lapse, watching layers of displacement and removal? People don't just live on blocks. They create identities, senses of self based on landmarks, based on memories of what happened on a certain summer day. Watching a university do away with those things has a psychological, spiritual, personal impact that we can't fully capture.
It wasn't just colleges that this was happening to. There were other projects that were happening and dividing communities. Could you talk a little bit about that for me, please?
I will keep this short as I can keep things, for those of you who know me. Our society in Virginia created a place called Colonial Williamsburg in the 1950s. And believe it or not, that was a physical representation of all of the guidebooks that every city in Virginia created for itself around the turn of the 20th century that erased black people from every city. You didn't see any representation. The images were all white. Colonial Williamsburg had to remove First Baptist Church because it didn't represent that view, that image, that idea that they had of what the world they wanted. And so government and private industry have been working hand in glove for over a century. Actually, now it's about a century and a half, to try to erase not only the advancement of blacks, but also their property. We would see at the end of the Civil War when blacks purchased, they didn't occupy, they purchased abandoned lands, abandoned by Confederates. And of course, Andrew Johnson came in and gave that land back and did not compensate African Americans for the loss of the land. And we would see this time and time and time and time and time again. When the railroads come in, where would they decide to put the railroad lines? Right through black communities or right through the property owned by African Americans. Or let's take Princess Anne County when it became Virginia Beach, where you had over 20 plus black communities. And Virginia Beach, which was a sundown town, let me just emphasize that, passed laws, ordinances prohibiting the construction of or the addition or the improvement of any home if there was no water and sewage brought in. And so African American families did not have the resources, as well as most white families, to do that. And so then many of them started abandoning their properties or selling their properties. And as soon as enough of them did, the city of Virginia Beach used public resources to put water and sewage in those areas and sell the land to developers. This pattern is even repeated with the St. Paul's Corridor in Norfolk. Each time, it's as if black people should not be here. Now, that's not a new concept. If you're black, you've heard that over and over and over again, especially if you're in my generation and I'm one of the baby boomers. You've heard that over and over and over again all your life. Go back to Africa, and my response is usually, well, you know what? You need to go back to Europe if you're going to tell me to go someplace. And, but that's the idea that people have in America. And so they've used the law. They've used the courts. If it were not for Hampton University, we would have lost Emancipation Oak because they use all their power to stop the destruction of it. Why? Because they as in the state, decided to put I-64 through Hampton University's property. And if you look at every single interstate and road system, major road system in this region, it goes through every black community, through the middle of every black community. And usually they target the business districts. That is not circumstantial, that's by design.
Thank you. Thank you. Lou, Congress changed the Fair Housing Act in 1959 to make things, I'm assuming, a little easier for colleges and universities. Could you expand on that a little bit for me?
Yeah, so a number of prominent universities, including University of Chicago, University of Pennsylvania, NYU, Columbia, lobbied Congress and said the only way that they can grow is to have this power of eminent domain attached to university expansions. So Congress said, yeah, we think that's a great idea. And in fact, for every dollar that a city puts in to help a university expand, the federal government will put in $2. So you had an enormous subsidy. And just between 1959 and 1965, about 20,000 families across the U.S. were displaced by eminent domain for the sake of a college or a university. 8,000 of those families were black families, far disproportionate to what was happening in the general population. So at the time, colleges and universities and their leadership said the best place to build a school was near a neighborhood that they considered not on the decline. And if it wasn't on the decline, they would make sure that it would go on the decline. And this led to all sorts of displacement, particularly in Philadelphia. And as we see in Virginia, it happened in Norfolk, it happened in Charlottesville, and it happened in Newport News.
I'm kind of having a flashback about the Charlottesville, because I remember Vinegar Hill and, the folks talking about our neighborhood wasn't blighted. And I would like somebody on the panel to talk about that, how they use that word blight to condemn, to say these neighborhoods shouldn't be standing. And there's maybe one or two homes there that are abandoned.
Yeah, so blight has historically been the easiest route to condemn for whatever the intended new use was going to be. And how that would typically happen would be that the locality, and so in Virginia, a lot of this was done by our housing authorities. And so what would happen is the city would come up with whatever new great idea they had. They would then go to the housing authority and say, well, we want to replace that area with X, Y, or Z, whatever it might be. So they would commission a blight study. They get to define the areas they're going to study, and they would then go out and they would, not surprisingly, declare the whole area to be blighted. Didn't matter if your property was or wasn't. Didn't matter if even 51% wasn't. There are studies in Virginia where the blight findings were in the 30% of the area that they chose to identify. And that was good enough to take the whole darn area. And what kinds of things might make an area blighted? Well, in the early 2000s over in Roanoke, the Carilion Health System wanted to expand, and they wanted 110 specific acres, and they went to the city of Roanoke, who then went to its housing authority and said, go do a study on this 110 acres. Not surprisingly, they came back and said, yep, it's blighted. And what were the things that added to the blight and contributed? Well, there are cracks in the road. There are cracks in the sidewalk. There are little rooted vegetation growing up in the sidewalk. Well, wait a minute. That's your responsibility. What in the hell is that doing in a blight study? So they would use things like this to identify the areas that they wanted to take. And it was very, very easy. And this happened all the time. They would go out and they would do these studies. They would then leave the plan on the book for dozens of years. And so by declaring an area to be blighted, guess what? It became blighted because nobody wanted to invest. It had already been targeted for acquisition. And so everybody kind of threw up their hands and said, well, why spend our money here? Why should we do it? And it happened over and over and over again. And so they would leave these on the books. It would just sit. Sometimes they'd move a little bit forward, sometimes they wouldn't. They'd reenact them every 10 years or so. It's what they had to do under the statute. And this would just be perpetuated. Well, that Roanoke case and a couple others around the state got some good attention finally from the politicians. And they said, you know what, we shouldn't be doing this. And in 2005, you may remember, there was a U.S. Supreme Court case, came out of Connecticut, and the U.S. Supreme Court said, you can use the eminent domain power to remove blight or to hand that area over to a company for economic development. And that's exactly what was going on in this Roanoke case, Carillion. It was economic development under the guise of blight removal. And so in 2012, finally, we passed in Virginia at 75% approval. Everybody was for this, right? 75%. We approved what was question 1 on your 2012 ballot to reform the Virginia Constitution so that those kinds of for-profit takings and blight removal couldn't happen. And so today our Constitution says that you can't go in and take an area that's blighted. A property itself must be blighted. And there are sometimes good reasons, for health, safety reasons, that a particular property might be a problem. But you can't use that property to take the neighbors who are good citizens and keeping up their property. So that blight removal in Virginia is largely been eradicated. So we don't really have that as an easy angle for the government to now take property. But that's Virginia. That's not everywhere. About 37 states passed reform in response to that 2005 U.S. Supreme Court decision, but they don't all go as well as Virginia did. So that is still a tool that is out there. New York City, all of our major cities still have that power, and they use it like crazy for these economic development under the blight removal banner.
Okay. Yes, absolutely.
My comment doesn't specifically speak to the blight legislation, but it does speak to what cities have done, and that is all of the black neighborhoods in cities in Virginia and throughout the nation were redlined. And when they redlined them, they also put fewer resources, city resources, into those areas. And they also located public nuisances within or next to those neighborhoods. And they also created public dumping grounds, sometimes toxic, and put them into those neighborhoods. And they also didn't enforce codes for how houses were to be maintained, and many of those houses in black neighborhoods were actually owned by whites, and in the city of Norfolk, they were often owned by city council people and the mayors. And they did not enforce the codes. And so after a period of time, those areas became not only blighted, but they called them slums. And they allowed for, They didn't put in sewage systems. They allowed a lot of flooding to occur. They did not repair the streets. Some cases, the streets were not even paved. And so the city systematically allowed areas to be blighted and to be seen as a slum area for the purpose of eventually taking that area. And you would kind of see this begin, and over a period of 20 years, they would use these rules and these powers and these excuses to take over the area piece by piece by piece. It always occurred in pieces. You know, they would just eat away at it. And when you look at Shoe Lane, that's exactly what they did. They took it, they dismantled it piece by piece by piece, but the goal was always to take the whole thing.
Lou, can you share a little bit about what happened in Lambert's Point?
Lambert's Point was in the 50s, predominantly African-American, middle-class, working-class neighborhood that was stable and was also the target of William and Mary's expansion for Old Dominion University. And so in the early 60s, much like what was happening at Christopher Newport, the city of Norfolk decided that they were going to take blocks and blocks and blocks of properties from black families. The families were given little notice, and when they went to public hearings, they were told, you've got 3 months to leave, you've got 6 months to leave, we'll help you, but often they were forced to go into other neighborhoods, give up their property. And at that time, there was restrictions as to where these black families could relocate. That community still remains very strong. Just a few months ago, I was at their annual reunion. They get hundreds of people back every year to talk about what it was like to grow up in this special, safe community and the friends that they remember. And they come from as far away as California and Florida, just for 3 or 4 days back in their old neighborhood. And it talks a little bit about how important a home is and a property is more than its value. It's its community that's being diminished. And that, in particular, is a loss that it's hard to quantify.
Thank you. Cassandra had brought up the Emancipation Oak, and I want Josh to say something because your firm represents Hampton University, and tell us a little bit about what's been going on with that.
We do. Yeah, it's a great honor to represent the university, and the firm has represented for 20, 25 years, I guess, in a variety of different kind of takings issues. So when VDOT came along with the plan for the new Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel project, which stretches all the way up 64 here past the Emancipation Oak, we got a call from Dr. Harvey, I think, directly to Joe Waldo, my senior partner, and Dr. Harvey said, "Joe, protect the oak." And so we got involved to work with VDOT to reform those plans. So the first plans had the new roadway expanding even closer to the oak, and so there was a variety of meetings that were held. I think it culminated. I'm smiling at Bill because he was in the room where some of this all went down. So it culminated in a very public kind of pep rally at the university, where then Secretary of Transportation Aubrey Lane came down and spoke, as did Dr. Harvey, and promised that VDOT would not take any of Hampton University's land permanently, and they changed the project plan. They diverted the road further back. The state is paying for a monthly monitoring of the oak to make sure that its health stays pristine and that there's no change to its condition. But that was all done because Hampton knows how this game has been played before, and it hasn't gone well. And so Dr. Harvey, to his great credit, of course, told VDOT that they would not get 1 inch of Hampton University's property. And that's exactly the way this is going. They're not getting an inch. And so it thankfully has a happy ending so far. We're not done with construction, but so far that the state stepped forward and did the right thing, I think, and changed that plan and went further to say, we'll make sure that we're not impacting the Emancipation Oak.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Brandy, before we play our last 2 clips, I want you to address the issue of generational wealth and how these types of actions impact that. And if anybody else wants to add in, by all means, please do.
I think it's really simple in this particular case and in a lot of the communities that we talked about. Land is and has always been, in some cases, one of the ways that Black people could accumulate wealth, because you can pass it down to in and out your family for generations. So when you think about that in and of itself, and I think Lewis said this earlier, it's generational wealth in terms of passing down actual wealth. But when you have a community and a home, you're actually passing along knowledge and information to the generations after you. So when you have a Black community like Shoe Lane, and as I described them earlier, you have doctors and lawyers. There was even a NASA engineer. And if you don't know the history of this particular person, his name was Lawrence Brown, and he actually worked with Katherine Johnson during the time where the U.S. was in that space race and we were trying to launch to the moon, right? So when you think about those caliber of people who lived in this community, think about what they could have contributed to society collectively had they been allowed to stay and exist there. That's generational wealth, because you're passing along your experience to a young kid who maybe rides his bike in front of your house and he sees a NASA engineer and he says, that's cool, I want to do that one day, right? So it's not just financially passing down your equity in your home and having a place where your family can live for generations, but it's also passing down knowledge, skills, experience, things that Black people have limited access to as a race in this country, but can build for themselves and would have had the opportunity to build this type of wealth and be exponentially powerful in the city of Newport News had this been allowed to exist.
I saw you shaking your head. You want to add something? I saw you shaking your head. I don't know.
Oh, sorry. I would indeed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that was originally written, the pursuit of property. If you understand that the foundation of this country was laid written not in stone, but with ink, with that idea in mind, that the people coming from England sought to take property, that wealth and privilege was bonded to property. You could not vote if you did not own property. You did not have standing if you did not own property. And even today, if you're a renter versus a homeowner, your rights, your privileges, your standing is not seen as significant as a homeowner because you're paying directly property taxes. And so for African Americans, there has been this systematic taking of property, but it's worse than even that. This country started putting money with federal dollars into the creation of suburban communities, except for Black people. The law said only for white people. So Black people, wanting that piece of America's dream, put their own money into it and created these suburban communities. And many of these cities and counties have systematically taken that from Black people, putting public nuisances, taking the property because of eminent domain, because they saw them as not having the kind of political clout and power to stop it. And so they were seen as the most vulnerable of all of the people. They were incapable of fighting against it because, one, they didn't have the representatives who looked like them sitting there on city councils, planning commissions, in the courts. They didn't have them in the legislature because they had been eliminated by law in all of those areas. We forget that at the end of the Civil War, freedom's first generation, 10% became professionals and college graduates in one generation. And what did we see America do? We would see the American Medical Association ban black doctors as members. We would see the American Bar Association ban black people as members. We would see all kinds of national associations ban the presence of black professionals from those industries, and then they would start creating laws or influencing laws to harm black professionals, to create a hospital that would serve black people, but the black doctors could not practice in those hospitals, only black nurses. And so there's been this systematic attack of black people. And so here we are in 2023 with people still talking about how there's this huge wealth gap, as if the fault lies with black people. I want the conversation to change, because the fault doesn't lie with black people. It lies with a system that is racist and discriminatory and has not actually engaged in reparative justice. And that's what I'm looking for.
Okay, I'm going to play two more clips. I'm going to play them back to back. And then we're going to hear some final comments from our panelists, and then we're going to take some questions from you.
How do you grade Christopher Newport on their acknowledgement of the past?
I think we did the best we could, because I think the real collusion that was wrong was with the government of the city, the original terrible thing that they did. And but of course, in some ways, you could argue the school benefited from that. Okay, I don't think we need to apologize, but we need to acknowledge we benefited for something that was wrong. The school is the center of cultural and educational activities in the community, and I think it enhances the community. So there's always a price for progress, and sometimes people feel hurt by the progress, and I can accept that that is part of this progress. But I think on the whole, the pendulum swings towards positive.
We saw trucks coming in and pushing our houses down. That's hard to see.
The college is beautiful. It's a beautiful campus, and I think it has added to the area. But there again, we had to give up something for that. And so we have to, take that as it is.
See, my kids might want to live here, but they can't. In fact, I lived in my dad's property. Many generations in this country are doing this, but not us.
We knew that we had no future in this house right here, being here and living through we didn't know whether or not we would be able to live our lifetime here. We still don't.
Final thoughts, panel, before we go into audience questions?
So I'll just leave it with this. I heard everyone's moans when we heard Dr. Santoro say there's a price for progress. And I think the underlying point of our investigation is, well, what was that price? And who had to pay the price for that progress? And when you think about how cities, they move and they navigate advancing and creating opportunity for people in their communities, even today, I think we should think about who's been paying for that progress. And in the case of the Shoe Lane community, they paid a heavy price for the progress of having an institution established on land that they expected to pass down to their families for generations. And you heard in that last clip, the Johnsons say, we still don't know if we can live our lifetimes here. That's a reality that they've been living for the last 60 years. So I think when we think about the impact, because we want to tell these stories and we want to inform people about what happened to these communities, but we also want to create impact. We don't want to just talk about what happened and just leave it at that. I think we should be thinking about progress in a way that we are looking at how everyone can benefit from progress in these communities, in these cities, and think about how you can generate that without harming a significant, vulnerable community like Black residents in the Shoe Lane community.
My last thought is we need to move away from this old trope that the Black person in the movie who's so strong and so powerful, and they sacrifice themselves so that all the white people can survive. And I mean, it's an old stereotype, and they make these, usually it's a Black man makes him so honorable, but he can't live because there's no vision, there's no perspective of Black bodies in this picture. When all is settled and it's all nice and beautiful, Black bodies can't be in this picture. And so that old trope has permeated our entire society. It permeates movies, it permeates literature, it permeates government actions, it permeates decision making, it permeates how people see things. And I think it's past time, to change that old trope.
Thank you. Yeah. Before Josh, could you please explain the Mount Sinai Church?
This is a picture that I took. This is from out in Suffolk on, I think it's Old Key Road. And this is a historical marker from that marks the occasion of the founding of Mount Sinai Baptist in 1868 by newly freed folks who came to this area and would come to services here. And I just think it's a beautiful historical marker because of the quote I've pulled out to the side there that says, it talks about the pastor's message every Sunday would end with, buy some land, build a home, get some education. And I think that is such a concentrated quote of what we've been talking about tonight. The meaning of property is not just dirt. It's a sense of person and people, community, and it ties you to those generations who were here before you. And your grandfather used to read a book under that tree, and we had lemonade over there. We did whatever, right? And that's a part of property. That's not just dirt. And so, I think the quote is wonderful. I encourage you all to go see it sometime. It's just out in Suffolk, but it's I think, really consolidated way to think about property. And it is so fundamental. And Dr. Newby, Alexander, I appreciate the hearkening to the Declaration and talking about property, because that is how that trifecta was supposed to read, was property. And it's so fundamental. Without property, what other of our civil rights are you securing? And you just go down the Bill of Rights, and you're not. Without property, can you speak freely? Can you worship freely? Can you gather? No. You go to the Second Amendment. You get a gun so you can protect that property, right? The Third Amendment, they can't put the troops in your home. The Fourth Amendment, they can't search and seize your papers. That's your property. The Fifth Amendment, that is all about property. And so, I appreciate the hearkening to the Declaration, because I think that's the goal that we all aspire to. And this conversation, I think, is a helpful waypoint in our, I hope, collective effort to one day get there.
I agree. Now let's hear what you'd like to add to this conversation. If you have a question, please stand so we can get a mic to you.
Test.
I hold it.
Thank you so very much for allowing us to share space with you in this conversation. Thank you for your steadfastness to the Johnson family. I just had a question, understanding how eminent domain works. Can any one of you offer any suggestions on how communities can become collaborative in making sure that this doesn't happen? And I understand that there are rules and laws on the books, but there was something to be said about the Johnsons, and there are many other families that have stood their ground. But is there any words of wisdom that the Johnsons or you all can offer us, or community members at large, so that this doesn't take place in future communities?
I can offer a brief example. You saw Professor Devarian Baldwin speaking eloquently about what community means. And Professor Baldwin has served as an organizer for communities in Miami and Philadelphia that remain under threat from eminent domain. And so organizing is one way to really speak in a unified way against a very powerful government and a very powerful college and university system. And you know, the odds are really tough, because universities and colleges are not just places of learning these days. They are economic development centers. They are hubs to bring professionals in and powerful forces that ally with them. So organizing is one way to do it. And there are other legal ways too that I'm sure other people on the panel are better versed on.
Yeah, so organizing is always step one. There have been a couple kind of examples of this in Virginia with positive outcomes. The Atlantic Coast Pipeline was a huge natural gas transmission line that had been planned to cut through. It came out of West Virginia. It was basically going to kind of meander over to 95, and then it was going to have a spur line that came over here to Chesapeake. And that project was, in the end, canceled. They wound up about 4 years and $4 to $5 billion behind schedule because of a number of different challenges that they had. And one of the big ones was out in, I just blanked, I'm sorry, in Brunswick County, I think. There was a site that had been identified for a compressor station for that project. And of course, it was targeted to a majority-minority neighborhood and community. The community organized and rose up against that location. Not only was that eventually moved, but the whole project, and not just because of this, but that whole project went away. There's a smaller example of kind of the same thing in Northern Virginia, in a part of Prince William County. Amazon was building, as everybody is in Northern Virginia, data centers and cloud computing kind of places that require a ton of power. And I will tell you, this is going to be kind of the new frontier of how this is going to go, because these data centers are just huge energy hogs. So there was a project that was specifically for that installation. I think Amazon was putting 2 different buildings in. And it became called the Extension Cord Project, because they were running this power line through another historically black neighborhood. That community organized in a big way with their then delegate, Bob Marshall, and they rose up and defeated that whole project. Amazon backed down. I think they went to one building and they figured out a different way to route that power line. So, I'm here to say it's tough, but it is possible to win. It is possible to create change in these projects. And we see it all the time. The Emancipation Oak, I think, is another good example here of a positive outcome and reaction. But it is always being heard, being organized, and being willing to go out and put yourself out there to say no. We don't think this is right. But Lou has it right. The organization side of it just gives you the power, because what's so tough is you've got concentrated effort from a government or a corporation, if it's a utility, okay? And they know what they want to do. and they've been talking, and they're darn well probably going to get it done. It's very tough for property owners who are affiliated and friends, but if you're talking about 500 homes on a project, not everybody knows each other, right? And so there's a lot of just kind of inertia or entropy really, that's difficult to overcome in just getting people assembled. So it takes some community leaders, and usually in each of those successful instances, there's one or two folks who said, heck no. There's some good examples up in Baltimore where this has been going on, and some other places around the country, but in every one of those, it's community organization, and it's always one, two, maybe three folks who really kind of lead the charge and pay that sacrifice.
This is for, and I think my mic is off now, but this is for, I have enough bass in my voice. This is for either Cassandra or Lou. What's going on in our region right now in terms of these projects that we need to be keeping an eye on?
I'm glad they spoke about community organizing and directing your voice in a single way. What I see in a lot of communities, like the South Side community in Norfolk, that's made up of 5 different communities that include Berkeley and Oakleaf and Compostela and Compostela Heights. When you're talking about those communities that are inundated with, they are in a super toxic zone. There's more toxicity in that one area than in the entire region. And they are inundated with the idea that they're going to be flooded out with the building of the levees, and they can't even get a crossing guard for their school because the city says there's not enough money. It's just like one thing after the other after the other. But they cannot succeed because they're not speaking with one voice. You have to set aside all these different personalities. You have to set aside your ego. You have to set aside, because there's always somebody that's going to try to pay someone off. So you have to set aside those defectors. And you have to crowdsource your people. You have to wrangle them, basically. You have to somehow convince the naysayers that what you're trying to do is going to benefit them. And that is a difficult task. And, some of the places I've seen that are most successful, when you get, and this is going to almost sound sexist, but when you get some women determined because, women know we have a superpower that men can't defeat. We can fuss longer than you can ignore us. And the only thing men want is peace. And if a woman wants something and she can't get it, you will never have peace. And so, you've seen through the civil rights movement, the men have always gotten the credit, but it was really the women who did the job. It was the women who created the Montgomery bus boycott that lasted over a year. It was the women. They don't get the credit, and there are a few books now coming out now giving them credit. But they got the job done. They were the ones who organized it in the first place. And so I would say that is, what we're seeing in areas in Norfolk, in Portsmouth, Chesapeake, Virginia Beach, Hampton, Newport News, we're seeing the same things. We're seeing a lack of a single voice. And that voice needs to have knowledge, it needs to have unity, and it needs to have determination. When we get that, you will see change. And some of you in this room can be those voices.
I really don't know how I can follow that, Dr. Newby Alexander. But you touched on something important. The seawall project in Norfolk is one example. Our series looked at colleges and universities and the impact it had on cities. There are so many other projects that are always going to happen in Hampton Roads. The biggest project in Norfolk's history is this $2.6 billion seawall project. They're building a wall to protect the city from rising waters. What neighborhoods are they going to protect? And what ones are they going to leave to go underwater? There's winners and losers in all these choices. And there's property involved in all of these choices. So even though our series was more historical, it teaches something about today and what's happening today, and hopefully gives some insights into how communities can address it in the future and in the present series of projects that we're going to face.
So we're talking a lot about what communities can do, but I actually want to address the leaders in the room because even though our project is historic, I think it's very educational. If you look at a city like Newport News, like we're talking, since we're gonna bring it back to the Shoe Lane community for a second, and when you look at the city of Newport News, when you look at the demographics and where blacks live versus whites, where the Shoe Lane community was is still predominantly white, wealthy area of Newport News today. And so there was this undercurrent and unsaid effort during the time of the initial taking, as Dr. Santoro said, these are not my words, these are his, to remove the black spot. And I say that because essentially that was successful. That was a successful effort. The black spot, which were black residents at the time in Shoe Lane, were essentially forced out, right? And so they ended up having to go to either downtown Newport News, where at the time that was considered the less appealing place to live at the time. Most of the people during the 1950s and 60s in Newport News were trying to move out of downtown Newport News. They were trying to move up to central Newport News and further north because that's where opportunity was at the time. And so when you think about what the city looks like today, you can see the evidence of these racist-based actions that occurred during the 1950s and 60s. You can see the legacy of that in these cities today. And so when I speak to the leaders in the room, I am encouraging and hoping that our reporting will show that when policies are made in these communities to improve them, that number one, the residents' voices are not overlooked, right? That you talk to the residents who have lived in these communities, like I did with the Johnsons, to really hear the story and really what happened there. That will educate you on how to design policy to really help and improve these people's lives. And so that's what I would say. I know there's a lot of talk about communities organizing, but I think it's equally as important that leaders look at decisions that were made in the past and how they have influenced the condition of the people who are living in these cities today, and use that to inform you and make your policies after that information so that you can actually really improve the lives of the people who live there today, who were forced into these positions based on racist policies that happened during a time of segregation in our country.
Miss Kellum, you seem intelligent about Newport News. I see a lot of change in Newport News and Hampton, progressing over to Norfolk. And it seems like they're building relationships. Do you know the relationships that the policies and things that they're trying to build together? Newport News has changed demographically over the years, not for the better. Neither has Hampton. So are they working on bettering both cities, or what are they doing?
I think if I understood your question, you said that you asked me, I've done most of my reporting in Newport News, so you're asking me if a city like Newport News is working together to improve the city?
With Norfolk leaders.
Oh, with Norfolk. Oh, you're asking if these leaders in individual cities are working together.
Right. What are they trying? What are they working on now? What plans are they working on together?
I mean, here's a leader right here. He can answer it.
Not to be put on the spot, but I do have Councilman Vick. Where's Councilman Vick? And Dr. Best from the school board. So it's not just one person working; it's the school board and council. So briefly, from the federal government, they've allocated over like $1.8 billion. It's called the Reconnecting Communities Grant. Norfolk actually received that this year. We didn't get it for some reason, but I'm here now, so we're going to get it going forward. So that is, if you look at our Southeast community, we have interstate going through it, right? So the federal government through DOT, they've realized that, so we're working together. I saw Mayor Alexander, we had a meeting all day today. We work well together. I think when you see the Choice Neighborhood Initiative, both Norfolk and Newport News got those grants. So the federal government realizes the errors were done. They're trying to rectify it, but at the end of the day, you're not gonna have federal money fix the problem. It's going to be solved at the local level. So it's more than just city council. It's the school board, it's city council, it's our anchor institution. That's all of us working together. Hopefully that was a good, like, non-politician answer. Cheers.
We actually have time for maybe one or two more questions, then we're going to wrap.
My question is, where is a good point in the center for people to come together? And the reason why I asked that question, I'm going to give you an example. Recently, the Newport News branch had a banquet on the campus of Christopher Newport University. And there was a lot of discussion as to, there was a group of people, I will never set foot on that campus ever again. That's how angry they are and feel like that they were, they have a right to feel that way because of what happened with eminent domain. Then there's a group of people that says, yes, that did happen. It was terrible. But can we hold a grudge forever? Where do we come together? There's a new president now. Let's try to work together. So to the panel, maybe where do you start, like, getting people, and I think people are entitled to their feelings, because what I share with people is I know people that are still living that these policies impacted. It's not like the slavery argument where they said, can you name a slave? Are they still alive? No, I know people that are still alive that this impacted. So you have people that are really angry, and then you have people almost they say, let's forget about it, which I don't agree with. So what do you say about that?
So I think that the typical argument is that what's in the past is past. And I usually remind people that the first thing you do when you go to a doctor's office is write your medical history, because the past is not the past. It is in your face in many cases. And so what we have to begin to talk about is what really happened. Let's stop with the myth making and start talking reality. And that's just the first step, because you have to acknowledge that you are here, that this situation exists, not existed in the past, but exists. And that there are people who are harmed by that. And that some of the people are still alive and some of them have gone on, but their descendants are still being harmed by those actions. And so we have to start talking realistically about that and then begin to work towards reparative justice. And in so many people's minds who don't want to talk about that, they think you're trying to take money from me that's mine. And I have to remind people, the public owns everything, really. Private ownership, yes, but eminent domain allows the public entities to take what you say you own. And so it's a interesting situation, but you look at how money was distributed or misdistributed. How many times did we see black schools underfunded? Recent articles still came out, recently came out talking about how our HBCUs are still being underfunded by the state. Still being underfunded by, can I repeat that again? Still being underfunded by the state, because the state created a formula that would underfund them. And so the way to change that is to change the formula, right? But then you also have to give that money back, and you cannot give $20,000 back from 1914 or 1950, because it's not, whatever that $20,000 was in that time period is a different value today. And so you have public funds that should be involved in reparative justice. You have some private companies that have been involved in some really shady things, and they should be held accountable for that. And it doesn't matter if the person who did it is not alive anymore. It was the entity that did it, not those individuals. And so I find that our society always stops talking about reparative justice when it comes to Black people. That somehow we can give land back, sort of, kind of, to Native peoples and create reservations, but Black people are never owed anything back. And I really believe that we need to stop letting people say that without challenging what they're saying. Virginia in the 1940s was revealed, caught with red-handed, for not giving the taxpayer dollars that Black people paid to go to the Black schools. The differential was between $2,000 per district and $30,000 per district. They were redirecting Black tax dollars to white schools. And this went on for decades and decades and decades. And so we have a lot of reparative justice to engage in. But people are still frightened of that because they think it's going to come out of their pockets. And I think people need to take a stand collectively, because, you know, we live in a society where what impacts you impacts me. There's this thought, oh, if I pollute this community right over here, somehow the air is just going to stay right there. The air doesn't stay right there. Air is air, and so it's going to go everywhere. That's why we have high asthma rates in Hampton Roads. That's why we have high, and I apologize for all the coughing, allergy rates in Hampton Roads, because we have polluted or allowed people to pollute our air and our water and our soil. And so it's time, I think, that we start engaging in demands for reparative justice. But in order to do that, each community needs to look at what they want. And so go back to Christopher Newport University. This is how you can repair the damage. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. After you all have agreed to those things, petition the cities, petition the state. This is how you can help us move forward, by repairing this damage, first of all, and then, I don't know the legal term, but there are personal damages, and then there is another type of damage, this punitive damage. And those two things existed because when you create an environment that's unhealthy, and that you're being sent the message that the city does not care about you because they won't even collect the trash, or they won't clean your streets, or they won't repair your sidewalks, or they won't make sure that public nuisances are not there. You have harmed the people psychologically to believe that they are not worth enough to have the best amenities that everyone else has. And so why aren't there community centers that look like good community centers in predominantly Black neighborhoods? Why do they have to have an old building that then is never repaired, or that is so old that everything is falling apart in it. And then the first thing the city will say is, we don't have enough money. You know, you do have enough money, that's just not the priority. So I think that communities can begin to sit down with these agencies that have created harm and begin, after they have had their conversations so that they're on one accord, to begin making demands.
I'm just gonna make mine. I'm gonna piggyback off what you said, but I'm gonna keep mine short. Which is, I think you asked, like, how can people meet in the middle? And Dr. Newby Alexander said something very key, which was, you have to acknowledge the harm that you caused, right? And so that is part of the reason why this story is even a story today, right? Because for the last 10 plus years, everybody thought that just people in Shoe Lane just happily sold their houses, gave them up, and moved on with their happy little lives, and they had no problem with what was happening to their community, which we know wasn't the case. And part of the reason why that narrative is a source of misinformation for people who knew what happened to the community is because the narrative wasn't fully told. And so, for example, I know there's a representative of CNU here, and I will say that the college did at some point acknowledge what happened to the community in 2019. They have this plaque up for a community member named William Walker, who was actually, he was a contributing member of society, so I want to put that out there. However, Mr. Walker was also on the board of visitors at Christopher Newport University. Okay, so he was a member of the community. He lived there, he was a real estate developer, but he also worked for the college. So I think that when you think about acknowledging like the wrong and the harm that you do, the first thing that can be done is to correct the narrative about what happened to that community. And then people can come to the table with an understanding that we're actually trying to make a difference. But I don't think that can actually be done until residents feel like the story is actually being told in a way that actually acknowledges people like Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Johnson, who still live there, who have been holding on to their homes for the last 60 plus years and have to drive past that sign every day dedicated to Mr. Walker that doesn't acknowledge anybody else in their efforts to save the community.
Hello, very nice to meet you all. My name is Morgan Norris. I'm a junior at Hampton University. I'm a journalism major with emphasis in cinema studies from the great Atlanta, Georgia. I'm glad you guys were talking about reparative justice, because we had the opportunity to go to the Congressional Black Caucus Conference and see what the Secretary of State of California is doing to kind of move toward that, and not just reparative justice, but harm-based reparative justice, which includes housing, which is why we are here today. So I want to know about the future and your predictions for the future on the side of the government. How do you think the future will look in regard to their standpoint on eminent domain? And do you think that, I mean, as the people, we can speak and we can do our petitions and we can definitely be that voice, but do you think this is an ongoing battle for the state of Virginia, or do you think that maybe someday they'll see the family like the Johnsons and how they've been hurt and kind of rectify that?
I can talk briefly about a couple of different programs at other universities that have tried to go in some way to make amends. At the University of Colorado at Denver, the college was cited on a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood, and dozens and dozens of families were displaced. The college set up a scholarship, and so descendants of those people who were displaced from that community have scholarships and get to go to University of Colorado at Denver for free. So hundreds of students have taken advantage of that. ODU has established also some scholarships for Lambert's Point community members. So that again allows the descendants of people who had their land taken have some sort of benefit from it. But as far as reparations and as far as restoring those properties, we've done interviews with several public officials and reached out to them. We haven't had anyone raise their hand in Virginia yet to say, this is a great idea. We'll keep calling, though.
Brandy, Lou, Cassandra, Josh, thank you all so much for your time. I'd like to thank the Johnsons for sharing their story. And when you go home, tell a neighbor that in 1915, black families owned 60% of the land in the state of Virginia. Start that conversation. You all be very safe going home. Thank you so much for coming out, and have a good evening.